It was a warm Sunday morning on the 10th of November 1929. About 3 miles outside of the town of Narrabri in northern New South Wales, William Boyd, a lad of 16, was out with his father setting traps to catch rabbits along the Narrabri Creek. They were about a quarter of a mile from the main Narrabri to Weewar Road. They had arrived at their camp on Friday and already experienced some excitement when a car crashed into a tree stump nearby, totally wrecked, but the 5 occupants all surviving. At 11:15, William was ahead of his father when he noticed around a bend in the reed-lined creek something laying on a sandbar, half in the water. Curious, he looked and saw it was an old chaff bag or potato sack, rotting away from being in the water for a considerable time. As he looked, he thought he could see clothing sticking out through holes in the hessian, and called for his dad. The elder Boyd, also named William, came and, like his son, had misgivings about the discovery. The sack was tightly tied at the top, and a nasty odour was coming off it. Using his knife, he cut open the tattered sack and got a good look at what was within. Both of them recoiled in horror. The sack contained the decomposing torso of a man, laying on its chest. The arms were tied tightly against the body. The legs had been hacked off just below the thighs, and the head too had been severed above the first joint of the neck. The tattered clothing on the corpse were a woolen shirt, cardigan jacket, and fawn gabardine trousers with patches on the seat, which had been cut off at the same time as the legs were. There were 7 bricks in a wheat bag in the sack, added obviously to help it submerge. The sack and its grisly contents were thought to have been thrown into the water very near to where it was found, either washed up onto the gravel or exposed by the falling level of the creek. An influx of water about a month earlier was thought most likely to have deposited the sack on the sandbar. Now the creek had dried and was more a string of waterholes connected by a small stream than a flowing watercourse. Official readings of the creek showed that from the 22nd of August until the 13th of September, the river remained at a depth of 6 foot 5 inches. On the 14th of September, it rose to 11 foot 9 inches, and the next day was at 13 foot 3 inches, before gradually dropping down to an average of 5 foot 6 inches. On the 11th of October, it briefly rose to 9 feet again. Police quickly learned that the sack had been laying where it was found for at least a month. A man named Huggins came forward to say he had seen it, and due to the smell, thought it contained a dead dog. He had even used it as a target for shooting practice, but didn't get too close due to the stink. Although most people had reacted with revulsion to the discovery, a bizarre parody of the crime was published by the Sydney Sun newspaper on the 12th of November, just 2 days later. It was in the form of a conversation between Per Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, discussing the discovery of the headless torso. Holmes declared it wasn't a natural death, to which Watson retorted, "Why, damn it, don't you reckon it's natural to die when your head is missing?" Holmes deduces that it is in fact suicide, a very determined suicide. Foiled in his attempt to climb into the bag in which he determined to drown himself, the unhappy fellow, finding himself too long, cut off his head and legs so as to fit in. Pass the cocaine, Watson, and don't look a bigger fool than you are. Initially it seemed that this could be an insoluble mystery. The body was unidentifiable. The clothing was in shreds. At first, all a medical examination could provide was that the man was probably middle-aged and of a medium build. Despite the difficulties the task posed, clues were slowly found. The bricks in the sack were found to be a local sun-dried variety, probably made 30 to 40 years earlier. One of the fingers on the right hand had been broken before death and had been expertly bandaged. Police hoped a doctor may have done it and could remember the man. In tracing the origins of the bricks, police began checking old ruins with brick chimneys and rubbish dumps. As they checked the local area, they heard about 2 men who were camped at an old ruin 3 miles west of Narrabri, known as Granny Smith's Hut, a place avoided by locals, for it was reputed to be haunted. Many years before, an elderly Scottish woman, The eponymous Granny Smith had lived a secluded life in the two-room cottage with its detached kitchen, tending to a small garden. A rambling grapevine still grew on a fence, but the garden had long ago been overtaken by weeds. After Granny Smith's death, the decaying building quickly became known as a place for swagmen to camp out when passing through the area. It was also not the first time violence had struck at the scene. 200 yards away from the hut in 1921, a man named Sidney Dillon was shot in the head while sleeping by a man named Ted Malone. Although apparently accidental, Malone was sentenced to 3 years jail for wounding with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. The two men had arrived in a utility truck and had been camping near the railway bridge and staying in the hut in August, having arrived looking for work. They gained some employment which lasted a few weeks. They were known to drink wine, gin and whiskey, and a woman had been seen at the hut on at least one occasion. One of the men showed a local his bank book, showing that he had a reasonable sum in the bank so that he could take out a loan. They became so familiar in the local hotel that the publican allowed one of the men to take a bottle of liquor on the understanding it was paid for in the next few days. He never saw the man again. The man's mate said the other man had gotten sick and had caught a train to Sydney to seek treatment. The second man attempted to sell the truck but found no buyers, even at a low price. After a few days, he drove away in the direction of Gunnedah. On one occasion, Constable Mackey, a local officer, had been talking to the pair and noticed one of the men had a bandaged hand. He was tall and thin and looked somewhat ill. At least one of the men had a foreign accent, according to the constable. Police searched through the old hut, intrigued to find dark bloodstains on the floor, but also acutely aware that rabbiters could have skinned their catch here, due to the large number of rabbits which lived everywhere nearby, even under the floorboards of the house. Old newspapers were scattered about inside, the most recent bearing the date 20th of August 1929. In one corner was found blue wrapping paper which had contained packets of cotton and an empty carton which had held antiseptic bandages. The ashes in the fireplace were sifted for clues but yielded nothing of interest. The ground outside the hut was dug up where the ground had been disturbed previously, but again without result. The Narrabri Council's boat, the Ellen, was provided for the police to carry out a search in the creek for the missing head and legs on Monday the 11th of November. The police search was finally rewarded at 3:15 p.m. on Thursday the 14th of November. Sergeant Warburton, Constable McCann, Trooper McGovern and tracker Ted Dillon had been in a small boat dragging the creek in front of Granny Smith's hut all day. The search was in a waterhole in the creek, 25 feet wide, 75 feet long, and up to 15 feet deep. McGovern was using a grappling iron when he felt something snag on it. "I've got it," he exclaimed, as he hauled it to the surface. What came into view was an old, muddy and rotting sugar bag, which, as he dragged it over the side of the boat, ripped open, disgorging its content. The severed head of the Narrabri victim rolled out into the bottom of the boat. It was fearfully decomposed, black and cracked, and there was doubt the dead man could be identified from what remained of the face. Meanwhile, other less grotesque clues were being uncovered. Police, watched by locals who drove in from Narrabri to watch the investigators at work, dug out rabbit burrows about 10 yards away from the rear of the hut. At length, one of the burrows, on a bank of the creek, was found to contain feathers, possibly from a pillow. They were stained with blood. At the same spot was found a Sydney newspaper dated 19th of August 1929. The onlookers were greatly excited when a find was made, thinking it was something to do with the crime, only for it to be revealed as a dead sheep. As well, a blue coat with a tag reading Scrivener & Co., Tailors of Tamworth, was found concealed in bushy undergrowth, halfway between the hut and where the body was found. The tailors checked their records for the past 7 years, but none of the names corresponded to those the police were interested in. Police learned that the truck, which the two men camping in the hut had been driving, had been sold at Tamworth for £50. The seller gave his name as Jim Smith. This was the name of the man Constable Mackey had spoken to, who had had his broken finger bandaged. Then suddenly news broke on the night of the 15th of November. A man had been detained at Glen Innes on the 13th of November, who denied any involvement with the events at Narrabri. However, by midday on the 14th, he had confessed after questioning and had been charged with the murder of Arthur Sorensen, alias James Smith, on or about the 22nd of August, 1929. The crime, which had appeared at first to be a candidate for the unsolved files, had been solved in just 4 days. The victim was born in July 1888 at Horsens, a city on Jutland in Denmark. Sorensen enlisted in the Australian Army on September the 8th, 1914, at the outset of the Great War. Concerned that his name sounded too Germanic, he changed it to the unremarkably British James Smith. He served with the 13th Battalion at Gallipoli in Turkey from May 1915, before being stationed in Egypt until 1916, when he was transferred to France. He was transferred to the 2nd Light Horse Reserve Regiment and then to the 2nd Anzac Cyclists Battalion in 1916. He remained in Western Europe until October 1918. He was demobilised in February 1919. The accused killer, Paul Minel, was born in Germany in 1879. As a child, he had gone with his uncle to southwest Africa, returning to Germany in 1898. Back home, he joined the army and served for 3 years. From 1901 until 1912, he worked at sea as a fireman on steamships. He arrived in Queensland in 1912 and decided to stay for a while, remaining 3 months before he again went to sea, landing in Sydney in August 1914. War had been declared between Britain and its colonies and Germany, so Minel was paid off and stayed ashore. He received permission from the Provost Marshal to go to the country. From 1914 until 1929, he had spent most of his time in country New South Wales as an itinerant worker, mostly in building. He sometimes used the names Jack Wilcox or Jack Booth. Minel related that he had first met the man calling himself Jim Smith, who told Minel that he was Danish, about 1927 at Warren over a few drinks. They then encountered each other at Quambone, or Coonamble, in June 1929. Smith invited the German man to join him in rabbiting, as by this time Smith had a truck. The pair eventually arrived at Narrabri in early August, where they camped in the old hut. One day they went drinking in Narrabri, when Smith met a woman whom he went off with for the rest of the day. The following day, estimated to have been the 8th of August, he returned, and in the afternoon the pair again spent their time drinking, arriving back at the hut at about 11 p.m. On the way, the truck was slightly damaged when Smith hit a stump. They continued drinking at the hut and had an argument about a building job Smith did not want Minel to take on. The sequence of events was provided by Minel, and there was some variation in his accounts, so how close to the truth he was is unknown. Minel asserted that Smith had rushed at him with a piece of brick as a weapon. Minel was able to punch him, and the two fell to the ground wrestling. Although Minel wanted to disengage, Smith would not let him go. After fighting for some time, it finished when Minel hit Smith in the head with a rock, causing a bleeding wound. Minel bathed the wound and applied iodine as an antiseptic. He asked Smith to forgive him and promised not to attack him again. Smith went and lay down in the hut, and Minel went and sat half asleep on the veranda in a folding chair. In a while he heard Smith moving about in the hut and went to check on him, finding that the other man was reaching for their rifle. Concerned, Minel grabbed the rifle and the two struggled to gain possession of the weapon until Minel tugged it away, whereupon he accidentally pulled the trigger. Smith fell back onto the bed, but as it was dark, Minel claimed he could not tell if he was shot or not. He took the rifle and went outside, walking around stupefied and still afraid that Smith might assault him again. After about an hour, he decided to check on Smith and discovered he was dead. He later said that Smith had not died until the following night, but regardless, when he struck a match and looked through the window, he found his mate dead and decided he had to hide the body. In a second version he gave, Manel claimed that Smith had woken at 5 a.m. the next day, and Manel had gone into Narrabri and gotten bandages and other medicine from a chemist, some more drink and some books for Smith, and had returned during the day. Manel claims he bandaged Smith's hand as well as his head, which suggests that the visit by Constable Mackey occurred at this time. In this version, the argument had recommenced that evening, and that was when Smith went for the gun and was killed. Taking an axe he used to chop wood and a saw, he hacked the body into manageable sizes for disposal in old sacks, weighted down by the convenient bricks. Manel kept his nerve by drinking rum and beer while he dismembered his mate. Having parcelled the other man up, he dragged the sacks to a tree in front of the hut and threw them into the waters of the creek. He then went to town and bought more drink. He said he did not sleep that night. The following morning, a man named Bolton and his wife came by. Manel told Bolton he would start work for him the next day. At the same time, Jim Smith's tent was in the hut, with Smith's head on it, hidden under a pillow. Although he remained and worked in the area for a few days, he did not sleep inside the hut again, instead sleeping in Bolton's woodshed for the next 8 days. Manel told anyone who asked that Smith had gone to Sydney. Once he finished working for Bolton, he left Narrabri in late August. He admitted he had heard at Orange on the 16th of September that the crime had been discovered, and he read about the discovery of the torso and followed developments reported in newspapers. Among his possessions when arrested were Smith's bankbook and the axe used to hack the body of Sorensen down to a size suitable to fit in the sack. Manel had withdrawn some money using the bankbook. Manel was driven from Tamworth to the hut on the 17th of November. He pointed out where events had occurred in the two-room dwelling, then visited the locations outside, stopping at the burrow where the bloody feathers had been found. Although he appeared weary and haggard, he kept up a rapid conversation with the detectives, answering their questions for about 15 minutes before the group left again. Police were still attempting to find the victim's legs. Hundreds of people, including children, gathered on both sides of the creek to observe. Some of the witnesses had driven miles to see the site of the crime. For hours a diver worked on his hands and knees, face pressed close to the bed of the creek, searching for evidence, but with nothing to show for it but a brick and an empty sugar bag by the end. Heavy rain on the morning of the 18th brought the search to a halt, and it was thought the legs may have been dislodged and washed downstream by the downpour. The missing limbs, as it transpired, never were located. The search for the legs, which were thought to have certainly been thrown in the river, was abandoned on the 19th of November. The murder trial took place in 1930 at Armidale. Manel did not take the stand but read out a statement in which he concluded by saying he had not intended to kill Smith. There was no evidence of a gun having been used on the body parts recovered, but Manel said it was dark and he only thought he had shot Smith as the other man fell back onto the bed. It is possible the bullet missed, but police did not find it in the hut. Smith was determined to have died of a fracture of the skull. Although Manel said he had hit Smith once, there were fractures on both sides of the head. The jury, having heard the evidence, returned a verdict of not guilty of murder, but guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter. On the 29th of April 1930, Paul Manel, whom the judge described as one of the most callous, cold-blooded and calculating individuals to have come before the court, was sentenced. Addressing Manel, he said, "You are a lucky man not to have been convicted of murder." Manel was given a sentence of imprisonment for 15 years. Manel shook his head and walked from the dock. It appears he did not serve the full sentence, for he died at Mudgee on the 13th of October 1944, aged 65. He had worked as a carpenter in the area for some time prior to his sudden death. He was buried in the Methodist portion of the local cemetery.